in a, I better not mention it, a cathedral. We were interviewing for a cathedral organist, director of music, very big cathedral in the north. And one of them came in, and a classic kind of choral tradition training and all that. He said, do you ever introduce anything else other than this? Have you had any experience or whatever? So, well, there was a song I used from 1968 once that was quite helpful. And that was all he said. That was all he said. I was just so unbelievably depressed by that kind of dichotomy. So that, exactly. I mean, that's where I'm at. If it just on the very practical note, this is widening the discussion. Of course, we're widening the discussion there. Just some reflections over the years on that, or bringing those things together. The bottom line is theological. The arguments, the basic arguments must be theological always. The parable of the bone I use quite often. If you have a dog and it's chewing a bone, if you try to take the bone away, what happens? Now, it's the end of your hand, really, isn't it? Okay? If you put down a slab of meat next to the dog, the bone gets dropped and the meat gets taken. So there's something about modeling something very good that makes people say, hey, what's that? What's that? That's nice. I remember once doing this with a choir, which is, a church was absolutely split up in the middle on this kind of dichotomy. And we got the choir singing a kind of crossover piece that could have been a song or a hymn, who knows what it quite was. And they did it absolutely beautifully. It was very different from what they normally do. They loved it. And for the first time in about 10 years, many in the congregation went up to the choir and said, what was that? What was that? You see, now that's the parable of the bone. You don't go up to the congregation and say, we're not going to have any more of these anthems, or you know, like that, or whatever. You give them something else as well. Actually, it's a bad, because I don't want to suggest that the anthem was a bone, but you see what I'm trying to say on that. So parable of the bone. The other thing is to find crossover items. That is, items that can't instantly be categorized. So with that particular church, we had a 94-year-old organist who was played with the choir normally, right? We had her playing the bass line in a song along with bass guitars and drums. And she said, hey, this is fun. He said, why haven't you done it before? She said, because no one ever asked me. Okay. And then you had the choir singing, and it was completely, we had them actually meeting each other, and that's the other big principle. It's all about people as well. It's not basically about music or sounds. It's about people. And most splits, it was a classic split in the congregation, the people do not know each other generally. In some churches, I've done nothing more radical than say, please have a cup of coffee together once in the next year. It will be absolutely transformative. Because they don't know each other. And so they're not asking the question, how does this style mediate the gospel for you? I can't stand it. It turns me right off. But what's here? I want to know. That's the servant question, I think. I'm prepared to listen to you. And amazingly, the other side very often say, well, that's interesting you asked that. It does this. Now can I learn a bit from you? And when you see that, that's the miracle of grace happening in a congregation. Does that mean you keep both sides or everything? No, not necessarily. Not necessarily. But you've at least started talking to each other. You've at least started talking to each other. It's about people, basically. And the last thing, if you're introducing change generally in music, I would say, is the question of patience. There's a church I know where I was involved in workshops, and enormous changes did happen over the music. It took 3 years for anything substantial to happen. It's patience, and it's love, and many of you will be in those situations now, and you will know that much better than I ever could. So I have no real right to tell you that, but you'll know what I mean. You talk about patience when it comes to music. The patience of eternity. Okay, anything else specifically on this? Or widening, which is all right. Yeah.
Right here. One here.
One here? Yeah, great.
A comment on my own experience. I think in general, it's, in terms of seeing the high priesthood of Christ through music, it's been a surprise. It's not been something I was anticipating, and it's happened, I think, in sort of 3 patterns, 2 of which are corporate, and one has sort of been very personal. The first corporate would be sort of in a huge group of Christians singing an incredible psalm, or song, like, you know, Crown Hymn, you know, at what we call Urbana when I was in college, or walking into All Souls one Sunday morning and hearing people sing For All the Saints, and you have, you know, 1,000 or thousands of people singing with you, and you're sort of lifted up, you feel like you're lifted up into the presence of God. There are other times in corporate worship where the combination of the music and the words, in a sense, breaks my heart in a way that I can't even sing, that I will be crying so much that all I can do is listen. And then there are times sort of in just personal worship, maybe just sitting listening to a CD at home where there will be something that, in a sense, just draws me to Jesus in love. And I think all of those are sort of very different, but they all happen as complete surprises.
Just write that down. That's great. Lovely. Says it all. Says it all.
I want to focus on the second question, in particular, change, in italics up there. Music is a huge and terrible problem, and you can feel all the different opinions in this room with regard to style and where we are. And I think Iowa City, in particular, is in a point of transition. This is a very lively debate here, the old versus the new. And so when you take into account the fact that in a small and medium-sized congregation of several hundred people, 100 to 300-400 people, you might have one, maybe two, if you're really blessed, 3 full-time pastors, and each one is a pastor of 4 or 5 different things. And everything else that's going on in that church is volunteers and people trying to do it on nights and weekends. And in particular, this dealing with different styles, different contexts, and different cultures takes an incredible amount of skill and planning. And then you're, dealing with the message from the pulpit every week and trying to plan music around that. And you have all these volunteers around who are all of us amateurs. How in the heck do we change? How do we even have a path or a plan to change, to approach this corporate worship that everybody is excited about and can participate in when we aren't all full-time ministry workers?
Gosh, well, it's just such a huge question. I'm trying to think specifically. It just depends where. A lot depends on where you're situated, doesn't it? As a member of the congregation, by speaking, by encouraging musicians when they do something well. These are very simple points, but just saying, thank you, that worked. By being on a committee or a working group that is responsible for the worship and arguing a case, not aggressively, but arguing a case. By holding the minister and others theologically accountable. Why are we doing that? Why are we excluding this type of music? Maybe right to, but why are we doing it? And what's the rationale behind that? By being alert to things that are going on in churches and other places. Experiments, things that work elsewhere. By encouraging a slab of meat experience, in other words, the gem that makes people look and listen, and by doing anything you can to encourage that. But don't do yourself down in terms of kind of, significance in that. Interesting, the church you've just described there, medium, 300 or 400, 3 full-time, that to Britain is a mega, 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 mega church. Okay, I'm in a church where the choir master gets, I think, expenses. That's it. I don't think he gets paid. Choir of 30, congregation of 70. We rehearse every week. We have an organ. We have a clapped-out old piano. That's the situation I'm in. Okay. I would do far more unaccompanied singing. Far more. Getting people singing in harmony, getting the congregation to enjoy themselves and hear glorious sounds and the kind of sounds that they can make. And not introducing things as big changes. Just be subtle about it. Try something different, but don't introduce it by saying, now we're going to do something different. No, it's a bit of psychology. You don't say, it's like when you're teaching some difficult song. You don't say, there's a rather difficult song, this, it's in 5/4, and it's got a kind of funny beat, and let's all clap hands backwards and whatever. Just get on with it, do it, okay? And it will happen. Now, John Bell is one of my heroes in this respect. You know that name, John Bell of the Iona community. Never, ever uses instruments, hates instruments, and will just stand up in front of you and just sing, and you sing back. And he gets these vast congregations and tiny congregations and groups of kids in the roughest parts of Glasgow and schools and all of it singing 4 or 5 part harmony, and it just happens. He doesn't say, I'm going to do something different. And that kind of music has had a huge impact across Britain, actually, in this country as well, in many places. I'm sorry, those are just a kind of scattering of answers, but you're dead right. It's a superb question. I do have something on tape might relate to some of these. I might play in a second. But anyhow, Kevin.
My question was whether or not you'd be willing to play a short piece that, for you, particularly mediates something of the gospel. I know that last night you played wonderfully, but you were illustrating things and never quite got through a whole piece. So.
I don't think I could just play a piece that would just instantly mediate the priesthood of Christ. Quite. I know what you're saying. I know. That's right. I know. I'll see if I can play a piece at the end, okay? I'll play a quiet piece at the end. Okay. And I'll make some huge effort to relate it, particularly to these themes. And the other thing is I haven't actually practiced anything specifically for this group, so you have to understand. It'll be a bit sort of thing. Okay, that's made me nervous. Okay, never mind. Right. All right. So I would quite like to play. It's in light of a lot of these comments. Just something on tape I have here. But is there somebody else, perhaps, before we do one last comment?
I just wanted to add a comment to the first question. To me, in my experience playing in a band in church, I feel that the priesthood of Christ has come across very strongly, especially when we feel that when we aren't doing well, and like when we play and things go wrong, but still after the worship, people come up and say, "Oh, that was such an uplifting experience," and that's something that we never even thought we could do because we were doing so badly.
That's a great point. Were you here last night when I was talking about the redeeming of a mistake? One of the absolutely critical roles of the high priesthood of Christ, I'm so glad you raised it, is to redeem our mistakes, to take our imperfections and our messiness and our kind of all over the placeness and focus, concentrate, purify them. So that although we only notice the mistakes, what's happened is he's mediated something of himself to another person. That's the miracle of grace, isn't it? Now, we must be careful not to presume on that too much. You know, rehearsal doesn't matter, let's be sloppy, Jesus will carry it, you know, in the end, sort of stuff. So you don't presume on that, but when something really does go wrong, it's sometimes well not to take it, if I put it, too seriously, because we can rely on him. So that's what he does with our prayers. If we get our prayers wrong, we'll mess it up. He's praying perfectly, and he will take those prayers and make something of them. So we can, as it were, lean on him and relax a bit. I often say to church musicians, God has had a heck of a lot of practice of dealing with human mistakes, about 2,000 years of dealing with human mistakes in the Christian church, you know. And you don't presume on that, but there's a wrong kind of anxiety. And also, frankly, when you're a church musician as well, I believe that if you're a church musician, you do have to concentrate on the technicalities. I think that this myth that I must have my heart purely on God and not whether it's C major or A minor or whatever, that's ridiculous. There's nothing wrong with being on the technicalities, but it's a kind of obsessive fear of mistakes that can be paralyzing to you and to a congregation as well. If you're driven by fear of going wrong. It's like when you're playing a piece, you know, is your primary desire to get it across and do it nicely, or is it not to make a mistake? Do you know that? You know that kind of two very different ways of doing it? Boy, I feel with choirs, I'm just terrified of conducting choirs generally, and I'm thinking, heck, what's going to go wrong most of the time? And of course, they sense that. They sing badly, and it goes wrong. Surprise, surprise. Same with orchestras, but I feel less. Orchestra players are much easier people generally, yes.
Assuming then that some of the contemporary music, pardon the terminology, we're not supposed to say contemporary, but anyway, you know what I mean. Yep. Assuming some of that is good, some not so good, are there criteria for judging good versus bad?
Right, okay, that's 1 minute. I often get this question. I'm going to have to answer fairly generally, okay, to that. It seems to me criteria for judgment fall into two categories. The first is aesthetic, the second I'm going to call functional. Aesthetic, a piece has aesthetic qualities, or ought to, and one of them is unity and diversity. A fine piece, I think. Unity and diversity. Another is what I call aesthetic richness, that is levels of depth, so that you hear more and more each time you hear it. And my fear about some kinds of music in worship is it delivers like that, and you're not going to get a lot more by the next time. Okay, but there's other music that delivers more and more. That's the richness thing. Unity and diversity is about, well, it's clear, it's about unity, but also huge variety and of particular things and different things within a piece. I think that's another aesthetic quality. So I will be judging it aesthetically first. But, and it's the other thing, you've got to take its function seriously as well in a particular context. That's what I was saying last night. Music always interacts with a context. So you have to ask, not simply, is this music good, or whatever. You can ask, is it aesthetically good? But then you have to ask, is it good in this particular place, with these people, in this building, at this point in the service, in this culture, whatever. Music doesn't happen in the abstract. It happens in very concrete, specific places. And there's no way, very often there is, sometimes, but very often there's no way you can predict what it's going to do. You can have a go, but sometimes it's very hard to know. You just keep on having to ask, what's going on here? That's why evaluation is very important in worship, in music and worship. To look back on a service and say, what happened there as far as we can tell? What happened? How did that music function as far as we can tell? Did it mediate the life and the presence of God? Perfect aesthetically as it might have been. Right? And if it didn't, then sorry, it's not good for that time and that place. And similarly, some music, of course, can do fantastic evil. Good music, great music, aesthetically, can be used for evil purposes. Schubert's quartets, as they went into the gas chambers. So you have to constantly ask aesthetic questions and then functional, practical questions. That's what makes it such fun, because you're constantly asking, what's going on in this congregation? What's this music doing? What's happening? What's it going to do? That's a very, very general question. Jason, I think, oh, sorry, one more, yes.
Music is an art. What can you say about the use of creativity within our musical worship?
Creativity?
Yeah, like...
Anything particular in mind?
More just writing and things like that, and are that as a musical worship, and be it in whatever style it is, and how can that be incorporated into a corporate worship, into art?
By creativity, do you mean improvised elements, you think particularly?
Or writing of chants or songs or things like that? I mean, should that come out of the congregation, come out of the worship leader?
Okay, phew, these are massive questions, very good ones. We're going to go over, is that all right, Jason? I can't do this in 30 seconds. Is that all right? Is that all right? Okay. Right, two areas to comment on that. Creativity, that means the creation of a work of art. That, of course, is a work of the Spirit. It involves novelty. It involves, though not least, a heck of a lot of hard work. Creativity is not just dreaming into the sky, thinking about God and writing notes. It's about tough work. And a key theological element at work there is the Holy Spirit. It also involves, I make a lot of point of this elsewhere in books, about, it also involves tradition. That means it involves, at its best, living inside an ancient tradition or traditions. Creativity is not spontaneous newness. It's not the same thing. It's not about reinventing the wheel every second. It's not about starting from scratch. You never start from scratch anyhow. So what I encourage people to do generally when it comes to thinking about creativity in worship is say, get to know a tradition very well. Every great composer did, every poet did, every writer does. You indwell a tradition, and then you can be creative. Now, the greatest essay on that ever written is by T.S. Eliot, 1919, called On Original Talent, I think it's called, when he talks about the most creative people are the ones who know a particular tradition and who've known, actually he's talking about the whole history of English literature really well. Then they can be creative. Most people think tradition is the enemy of creativity. Tradition is the start of creativity, if we're really interested in being creative. So I think that's the first point generally about creativity. Now, the other bit, some people use that word to mean the spontaneous in worship. The unplanned, the things that happen in worship that you didn't predict or planned, right, as well? And yes, I believe that's incredibly important. I think the basic dynamic of a worship service is of improvisation, where you have something like a liturgy, whether you call it that or not, you have something like a structure or a pattern. But on the day or on the occasion, you allow flexibility with that. And the improvisation of a jazz or blues or whatever is the perfect model for that. Now, you have too much of one or the other, things go all over the place. You have pure liturgy and utterly every last second planned or whatever, it goes stale and dull, right? And because you're effectively stifling the creativity of the Spirit. On the other hand, if you go for novelty and spontaneity the whole time, you know what happens. It gets incredibly dull as well. And people long for liturgy again. Surprise, surprise. And the real art is to have those two combined. So you have a radical faithfulness to a liturgy or a tradition, as I would call it, and spontaneity at the same time. And that's exciting. That's exciting when that happens. Yeah, can I just, an example of that? I just happen to have right here. It comes to mind. Would you mind? It'll take 1 minute. This was a service we did as part of a festival we put on, Theology Through the Arts project, some time ago in a Great St. Mary's, which is the university church in Cambridge. I've been working quite a bit with a group of drummers called the Psalm Drummers. These are percussionists from all over Britain, professional percussionists, majority in bands, rock bands, majority don't read a note, and they gather in large groups to pray through their drumming, effectively. I know it sounds a bit wacky, but it's all right, they're perfectly orthodox, and they read their Bibles, and they go to church and all that as well. But they're drummers, and I think the drumming may have more to do than just with keeping a steady beat in a band. So they get together with a huge number of percussion instruments in a room at least this size, I've been with them, and they'll take a biblical passage, or they'll pray, or whatever. And I've always wanted to get this group in a service. So we got them in Great St. Mary's, University Church. I mean, we're talking kind of high church liturgical here, okay? Along with, we had dancers and other things as well, along with the Bishop of Stepney, Ugandan bishop, a black Ugandan bishop who led the prayers. And what I wanted was the prayers, highly liturgical, to go with the psalm drummers improvising on these prayers. It was slightly hairy because it was also broadcast by Radio 4, BBC Radio 4, so all sorts of things might have happened. But they only had a quarter of an hour together beforehand. So basically they had the liturgy there, and 5 drummers we had up in the balcony round the top. And this was the result, and it's, bless their hearts. And they've met many times since. That's a really nice thing about it. Since they did this, they've met many times to work together. They do not read a note, these drummers.